Today on Context, the polarizing issues around the beginning and end of life, and why activists want you thinking about these issues at the polls. The upcoming Canadian election has many issues that matter deeply to our quality of life. And we're going to the streets for this edition to hear how the beginning and end of life are policy debates that have no simple solutions. If you were among the 1 million Canadians who found this in your mailbox in this election, meet the activists behind it.
My generation has grown up in a political situation where abortion is legal throughout all 9 months of pregnancy in Canada for any reason or no reason at all. And as a result, 1/4 of my generation has been killed through abortion. So I think as young people, as youth, we want to protect our youth and the youngest of our kind through doing this activism. And we know that our strategy is the most effective in changing hearts and minds on this issue.
So I've grown up in a pro-life home with a pro-life family, and I've done a lot of pro-life work throughout my years. And the reason I joined this is because as much as the good of the work I was doing, I wasn't seeing the results I wanted to see.
But the jury is still out on how effective these tactics really are.
I think this campaign by the Canadian Centre for Bioethical Reform, which to my mind is an extremist anti-abortion group, is a really ill-informed, negative campaign that's not doing anyone any good, including that group. When women go to abortion clinics, if they want, they can see fetal development pictures. If they ask, those pictures are available. I don't think anything should ever be forced onto women, and especially in this manner. These pictures are not education, they're not information, they're pure propaganda, and they're very nasty propaganda. And there's also a very strong element of falsehood to them. I don't know where the pictures themselves came from, but they're taken completely out of context. The woman is erased from all these pictures. Her circumstances are completely erased.
While groups like the ARCC and the pro-life CCBR might be miles apart, abortion is one of the few issues on which all major Canadian political parties agree. Abortion may not be a topic for parliamentary discussion anytime soon, but this election, activists want that to change.
We decided to initiate the No to Trudeau campaign when Justin Trudeau made headlines by saying that MPs for the Liberal Party are not allowed to vote pro-life on related issues. And so when we explain that human beings have human rights, and since the preborn are human beings like us, abortion is therefore a human rights violation, young people just seem to understand that and want to get on board.
We saw Trudeau last year hold the line firmly, and that did not hurt him in the polls. In fact, it helped him. So why would this campaign by the Centre for Bioethical Reform hurt him? I think people feel that we've had this debate through the 60s, 70s, 80s. People do not want to make it illegal again. The majority of Canadians are pro-choice, at least in most circumstances. And I think people don't want to reopen this debate again.
But there is a new generation of voters who do want this debate.
So when Leah was 12 years old, she came to us with the idea that she wanted to do a speech contest for her school on the issue of abortion. And we were a little shocked at the time because it wasn't an issue that our family was particularly passionate about.
As I started doing research and found out, that there are no restrictions on abortion in Canada at any point, that you don't technically become a human until the child's fully emerged from the birth canal. When I found out that issues like sex selection abortion and coerced abortion are technically legal in Canada, I was so shocked, and finding out through research, the procedures that are used to end the life of a child really shocked me as a 12-year-old.
My initial response was to help her to find another topic because her teacher had told her that that topic was too mature, too controversial, it couldn't be accepted in a speech contest.
And there was another side. Leah's mother had aborted her first pregnancy.
At the age of 15, I became pregnant, and it was a a surprise on the one side and not a surprise in the sense that I was sexually active. It was a very troubling time. When the abortion was finished, I don't know how to describe it other than feeling I woke up crying. There was sedation that was given to me to put me to sleep, and I woke out of that crying, and I basically stayed crying for the rest of the next 12 to 24 hours. And I just knew that I killed someone, and that's what I kept saying, is I killed my baby.
Just because a decision can be difficult for some women, or even really difficult for some women to the point that some women regret it, doesn't mean that we therefore should take away that autonomy from women. I mean, there's lots of things that we regret in life, you know, like half of marriages end in divorce, but, you know, we're not going to ban marriage because of that, right?
I became really passionate about the issue. It seemed kind of, it seemed crazy to me to imagine that, you know, I lived in Canada, a civil, humane nation, and yet this was happening all the time.
When she finally put her speech together, we were just really proud of her. So when I listened to her give her speech, it was so well done that I felt like I wanted to record it.
Some babies are born after only 5 months. Is this baby not human? We would never say that, yet abortions are performed on 5-month-old fetuses all the time. Or do we only call them humans if they're wanted?
The reality is that there are responsibilities that come with our choices, and that's why I say, you know, a mother has a right to choose what she does with her body, absolutely, but her right to choose ends where the rights of her unborn child begin. And that's why it's so important to answer the question, is the unborn child a human or not?
We can't just compromise women's rights or take those rights away in order to recognize the rights of fetuses. And I really think as far as whether the fetus is a person or not, whether we should care about it, what I always like to say is that a fetus becomes a person when the woman carrying it decides it does.
It's not just about women. You know, the unborn child is a human. It's a human rights issue. It's okay to have a conversation. We've lost that, and so the fact that we're not willing to have a discussion is one major reason why it's not talked about in the election. It's not talked about in mainstream media.
But her mother still had to reconcile their history on abortion.
I had tried to bury what I was feeling and tried to stop thinking about it, and constantly being faced with this issue of abortion, 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 and the reality of what it was through what my daughter was studying and what she was talking about made me have to come face to face with what I had done. But it also made me come face to face with the grace and the love of God and the ability of God to forgive even that sin. I think when I fully understood the character and nature of God, I understood that He came for the very reason. He sent Jesus to die for that sin. And when I understood that He didn't want to condemn me, He wanted to set me free, but He also gave me a voice. I feel like this whole situation with Leah wasn't obviously just about me and my situation and my need to kind of reconcile what I had done, but I feel like it was a redemptive act on the part of God. I don't think our number one priority should be not offending people. Our number one priority should be doing what's right.
While my own conviction on the sanctity of life comes from my belief in God, let's drop that argument for now. If we were to get political about abortion rights, science would have to back it up. Is there any scientific basis for a fetus being worthy of human rights? We'll look at that when Context returns. Welcome back. Before the break, we met the new faces of pro-life in Canada. They're making the case that human rights for the fetus must be part of the abortion discussion. We thought it was time to find out, what does science say about that? The front lines of this debate is found in fertility clinics all over the world, where cutting-edge technology is helping to create families.
Fertility treatment involves a team. Infertility can have limitations that can affect the sperm, they can affect the egg, they can affect the uterus. From the physician clinical side of it, they can manage some of those processes with medications, some of them with surgeries that improve the ability of sperm to get where it wants to go, sometimes improve the performance of the sperm. When that doesn't work, then there's assisted technologies where the laboratory can come into play. That's where my role and my people comes in.
Human help that stays out of the debate of whether or not rights should be given to a fetus.
I'm not actually sure that science has the ability or a role in determining exactly where you consider this life as we care about it compared to living cells or living tissue. I would see life as starting at personhood as well. But I think people's definition or perspective of what a person is highly variable. I personally, I don't see personhood as happening until after birth. If I treated a 7-day embryo as if it was a full potential person, I couldn't do my job, because there are ones that are frozen that will not get used, even though I don't know whether they have the full potential. I know that lots of them do. And you're dealing with a very technical environment that I'm dealing with cellular material.
Highly emotional cellular material that this custom clinic considers life.
In the Western world, for the last couple of thousand years, we've increasingly drawn the circle wider as to what it means to be human. And we've drawn it now to the point where really everybody is included except this one group. You've seen angry pictures of post-abortion babies on the street, and they may have an effect. For me, though, even for me, who feels very strongly about the rights of unborn babies, there is a tendency to want to turn away from such violent, provocative images. Until I think we really get a sense of who these people are, who these unborn babies really are as people, we're not going to be changing people's minds, because we won't have yet changed their hearts. The issue around abortion is this: there are really two vulnerable parties involved: an unexpectedly expectant mother and her baby.
This idea strikes home for me because the vulnerable parties Brendan is talking about once included myself and my mother. My experience came up during one of my lengthy conversations with Micah Rosendahl. You mentioned earlier that you, as young people, feel you are the generation who survived. I feel that way because I am one of many Canadians who were born when Canada did not have any allowance for abortion. And my birth mother has told me the story of trying earnestly to get an abortion. She tried 4 times, was refused at every turn, and I was born just a few blocks away from here in Hamilton, where you've been doing your protests. My mom was cared for at the Salvation Army home for unwed moms, just not, several blocks away again. It took an enormous amount of compassion and care for my life to land in a beautiful spot. It took a lot of spiritual depth and unselfishness from my adopting parents, from a lot of people in my life. And yet, here you are. Does this kind of public protest realize just how much care is going to have to be needed to stop these abortions and put these babies in a loving environment?
That's a really good question, and you're absolutely right when you say that women need a lot of support and help and care in order for them to give birth to their babies and to care for their babies afterward, and for their children to have good homes and good places. And so I think it's important to know that the pro-life movement is made up of 3 arms. There's the political arm of the movement, which seeks to change public policy. There's the pastoral arm of the movement, which helps women who are experiencing a difficult pregnancy or who've already had an abortion. And then there is the educational arm of the movement, which is what my organization belongs to. And so our goal is to raise awareness about the humanity of preborn children and the inhumane nature of abortion. But we work closely together with the other arms. So just recently, for example, when we met a woman on the street who saw our pictures of abortion and said she could no longer do that to her child, our work didn't end there. We followed up with her. We've been going to appointments with her. We introduced her to Hamilton Pregnancy Support Services. She had an ultrasound with Tiny Hearts in the area, and so the more connected we are, the more we work together, the more effective we will be in changing minds and saving lives, and then helping these mothers and children afterward.
The other end of the life debate when context returns. Context is back, looking at one of the most difficult election issues we face as Canadians head to the polls. For the first time in history, we're voting for a government which will have to decide what rules, if any, will govern assisted suicide in Canada. Here's a look at how the parties stand on the issue and how people are making their own choices on a difficult subject. The political silence on the topic of physician-assisted suicide is deafening. And this lack of response means that personal stories are shaping public opinion. Stories like that of Dr. Donald Lowe, who was diagnosed with a fatal brainstem tumor in 2013. It was his desire that he might choose the method of his passing. His story catapulted assisted dying into the national spotlight.
I'm just frustrated not being able to have control of my own life. Not being able to make the decision for myself when enough is enough. And I really envy countries like Switzerland and the Netherlands and the United States where this is possible. I mean, why make people suffer for no reason when there's an alternative? I just don't understand it.
Dr. Lowe is survived by his wife, Maureen Taylor, who is taking her husband's cause to provincial lawmaking.
It was only 1 week later after his diagnosis, because he knew that this was so terminal and such a poor prognosis, that he started to talk about Switzerland, meaning maybe I can go and have an assisted death in Switzerland because I don't want to die the death I'm going to die from this brain tumor. So, and everything he predicted about how awful it would be, I mean, except for the pain, thank goodness he never had pain, but the rest of it did sort of play out the way he worried it would. And now I'm motivated because I couldn't help him. I feel bad about that. I feel that I let him down, although he never felt that way. He knew how hard I tried. But I want to make sure this doesn't happen for other people.
Your story's been out on the internet. We hear stories here of people whose children were young or who were disabled. We've had people on our set who live with a disability and say, I am afraid.
As a person who faces challenges, I have to try potentially harder than people without disabilities to show that my life is of value and that I have something to contribute. And the ruling that says that my life is more about suffering and that I should maybe not be here as long as someone else might be, potentially gives the general public the idea that I have less to contribute.
The disabled are not the ones who are availing themselves of assisted death. It's usually people over the age of 80 who have cancer, who have a terminal illness less than 6 months to live. They're people, you know, largely like my husband. So they don't need to be afraid if they stop listening to wild claims on the internet and look at the evidence. And that's what we at the Expert Advisory Group for the provincial and territorial governments plan to do, is look at evidence.
It is possible that a government could choose to do nothing about the Supreme Court ruling,
Right.
isn't it?
Like abortion.
Like abortion, so we would have no law over how we choose to end our lives and whether we ask for help in dying.
That would be one option.
Would you support that?
No.
Why not?
So that people who have doubts can see that we can have strict safeguards in place. And on the other hand, I want to make sure there are safeguards in place so that the people who do meet the criteria have access to assisted dying. So you see, there are voices here of the suffering on two sides. People who say, I never want to have I don't want anybody to push me into this, and people who say, I absolutely want access to this, but maybe I live in a remote area. What if there's not a physician in my community who's going to do this? So those are both voices to be respected, and I think we need legislation to make sure that it happens with safeguards, but with access as well.
And what about conscience rights? Because now we've had the psychiatrists, 63% of doctors polled this summer saying, I don't want to participate in hastening death.
Absolutely, and I support a conscientious objection to this, not just from doctors, but if there do have to be other allied health professionals. I'm a physician assistant. We know that nurses are often there in palliative care. They should also have the right to not participate if it's not part of their belief system. But you know, we are talking about a small number of people in the grand scheme of things. Really, at the end of the day, and I work in a hospital with very sick patients, the first instinct is to live. And I do not see a lot of people wanting access to this. It's going to be a minority. And so therefore we don't need a lot of physicians. We don't need a lot of allied health. But for those who do want it, about 24, 25% of doctors, and I think it's going up now in the family physician group, would participate. That's probably fine, as long as we have good geographic distribution.
Language is so important in this. You and I both work in the craft of words. And so I take a term like assisted dying, and I think that's what we've been doing all along. Words like killing, I know, you know, your side of the debate versus my side of the debate, we would both react very differently to this. How do you feel about calling it killing, assisted killing?
I find that appalling that you would use that word. I mean, it's just like, I think suicide should be left as a word that we use for people who are depressed and mentally ill and are crying out for help. And I think killing should be reserved for, you know, people who intend to harm someone who didn't ask to be harmed. What I'm talking about are people with the capability and the capacity to know what they want. They're adults and they're suffering. And it's not my job to tell them, oh, I'm sorry, you haven't suffered enough. You need to live longer. They're asking for help to die without violence so that I don't come home and find my husband's brains blown everywhere or him hanging from the rafter. And they're asking that it happen peacefully and quickly. And that is not killing. That is ending their suffering in a humane way.
Dying with dignity, another of the phrases, has been owned by both sides of this debate.
There is dying with dignity and dying, as you say, a natural death. Of course there is. This was a phrase that came out of, you know, it's actually the name of an organization now. So I don't use that so much anymore. A dignified death is what you define it for yourself. And you should absolutely have the death that you want. And we do need to support people in palliative care. Very important, absolutely essential. And people who want to go to the ICU and be hooked up to every machine. I tease my dad about that because my dad and I feel differently on this topic. And I say, don't worry, Dad, we'll make sure that every hose and tube goes into you and you're kept alive. And he goes, well, I don't really know. So we joke about that, but that should still be there for people. So it's about choice. That's what it's about.
Conversations like this with Maureen Taylor about her husband's experience in wishing for death are happening everywhere in families across Canada. In my own family, my sister-in-law Margaret disagrees profoundly with Dr. Lowe and Maureen Taylor's choices, and yet is living with great dignity as her own family assists her in living every day until her natural death.
Lord is good and that He has a plan, and we don't know what the outcome it is, but knowing that His plans are greater than what we could ever imagine or even think. And so just trusting Him and growing in the joy that there is in knowing that life is more than just about kind of comfort and wealth and good things like that.
When we think of pro-life and pro-choice, we tend to think of America's Roe versus Wade and clinics swarmed by placards and protesters. Most of us do not expect the passionate young adults we saw today. Youth who feel a generation spent with no Canadian law protecting fetal life at any stage is wrong. Their effort to reignite the conversation on life shows they're trying to change our hearts that perhaps abortion might become the last option and not the first. When we think of physician-assisted suicide, we think of Europe, Sweden, and names like Jack Kevorkian. But now our Supreme Court has ruled that Canadian laws that criminalize assisted suicide will no longer be valid after February. Parliament has until then, if it chooses, to craft new legislation. Or a government could decide, like it did in the abortion ruling, to do nothing and just let us all work it out. The court ruling is broad, allowing killing to be done by persons familiar with end-of-life decisions in situations that are grievous and irremediable. In this election, more than any other, how elected leaders decide policy on assisted dying legislation is really in the voters' interest. Regardless of how you vote on Election Day, remember that your vote matters and that if you have an opinion on this issue, as much as we want to hear from you here at Context, the country needs to hear from you on October 19th. For all of us, I'm Lorna Duick. Thanks for watching. Join us next week as we explore life beyond the headlines.
Well, we all know Terry Fox as the inspiring young man who started his famous Marathon of Hope. But did you know Terry Fox has a faith story? And we caught up with Fred Fox, Terry Fox's brother. Well, Fred told us Terry was a Christian and accepted that he was put on this earth for a higher purpose. Well, it was Francis fever in the United States when the Pope came to visit, and our own Molly Thomas was on the ground in New York City covering it all as the Pope came to visit the UN.
Pope Francis addressed more than 100 heads of state in just under 45 minutes. And he had a lot to say to the international community, but at the heart of every single issue that he touched on was this cry for social justice.
Well, whether you watch The Late Show with Stephen Colbert or not, this man is bringing all things together and what it means to live out his faith. Take a look and read Lorna's Global Mail article on the Catholic Superstar. Well, you can find all these stories and more all at contextwithlornaduick.com.